Thanks, Erin.
Thanks so much, Sheridan, for that introduction. I'll just share my screen quickly. Okay, everyone see that okay?
We've got your notes view there, Erin.
Oh, again.
Again.
Well,
Beautiful.
Thank you, Sheridan. So thank you so much for having me come along this morning. It's lovely to see such a big community of practice for a Thursday morning. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri country today and acknowledge the custodians of the land, both past, present, as well as any First Nations community members here with us this morning. So as Sheridan mentioned, I'm a practice development officer at NTV, that's within our sector development team. And so yeah, today I'm keen to give an overview of the MARAM practice guides for adults using violence. So really just kind of a bit of a snapshot of how they're structured, how they're sort of looking, I guess, similar, different from the victim survivor guides that you'll be familiar with, and just kind of touching on some main points around risk assessment and management expectations. So just to start with a bit of a quick update, as Sheridan has already mentioned, the MARAM practice guides for adults using violence were released earlier this year. So that's everything except responsibility 7 and 8. And those two responsibilities sit at the comprehensive level. So we're hoping that they'll be released soon. I don't have a date for that, unfortunately, but very shortly they'll be released. And just to reiterate as well what Sheridan mentioned, that absolutely there is no expectation for people to start using the tools. There's a very clear message from FSV that the guides have been released. This is the opportunity now to just start reading, getting building that familiarity. The foundational knowledge guide has been updated as well, so a bit of a chance to read through that and see been included around working with adults using violence, but absolutely, yeah, no need to start using tools. That will happen after the training is released. Just to say as well, also FSV has released some other resources on the website, and I can also put a link to this at the end as well, just around an organisational checklist. There's kind of an FAQ, a video that they've done as well. So they've got a few more organisational resources up there, and there'll be some additional resources around embedding these guides that are coming up as well. And of course, the other update around MARAM that happened earlier in the year was that phase 2 organisations are now prescribed to. So a lot more of those universal services have joined us in the MARAM space, and of course are prescribed to the information sharing schemes as well. And just to flag for what's coming up, so I mentioned the training, that's sort of in the works. We're hoping to see that released in sometime next year, perhaps halfway through next year, for the adults using violence. The other thing that's been developed too, which is just sort of associated with this, is a practice guide for adolescents using violence in the home. So just to kind of flag, in the guides that are released for adults using violence, there is a bit of a provision in acknowledging that some of the content might be relevant for adolescents, using violence, especially perhaps older adolescents who might be in an intimate relationship. You might be sort of noticing some of the same narratives and behaviours, but there's a really strong caution that the work that you would do with an adolescent using violence is not the same as an adult. So just to kind of flag that there's more child-focused, more in-depth work around the adolescents using violence that will be coming up in the next while as well. Unfortunately, I don't have a date for that either. So in terms of the guides for adolescents, gosh, now I'm going to keep messing that up, aren't I? For adults using violence, it's quite similar to the structure of the victim survivor guides. So for those of you who are familiar, perhaps with that upside down triangle of the decision-making tool, there's those 3 tiers of sort of that identification level, intermediate, and then specialist. FSV have also updated that decision-making triangle. It's a little bit clearer now, a little bit sort of pared back. Yeah, I can put a link to that as well if it sort of helps visualize it. It's a bit tricky to put on a slide and still be able to read. So in terms of this mapping, obviously your organisational leaders will be responsible for mapping you at these levels. But just to give you a bit of an idea of where the sort of responsibilities sit. So at the identification level, this level is I guess for people who are able to interact with clients and could identify whether family violence is occurring or be able to refer to someone who can. And that tool is really just observational based. So you're just observing narratives, just observing behaviours. It's really kind of around encouraging engagement and rapport in order to observe that. And kind of sits, I guess, a lot with those universal services. At that intermediate risk assessment and management level. So this is for professionals who would be interacting with clients to assess and manage a presenting need. Also who might be working in crisis situations or with populations that are perhaps at a higher risk of experiencing or using family violence. So the intermediate tool, pardon me, is both, still has that observational element to it, as well as information sharing, and also has a conversation model that goes alongside it to sort of help people ask direct or ask questions that help elicit more information around their use of violence. So this level, I imagine, is where a lot of AOD practitioners would sit, along with probably a lot of mental health services, housing homelessness services. So this might be the level that I'm imagining quite a few of you are familiar with in the victim survivor space, and perhaps can expect a similar transition across for people using violence. And then we've got the specialist intervention and support. So this is, of course, for people who are working directly in a family violence specialist capacity. They're undertaking that direct safety planning and risk management. So this is the level that the responsibilities for this haven't been released yet, but it will have a comprehensive assessment tool that will take in all those information sharing, observation, as well as that interview style component to it as well, and then being responsible for leading that risk management and comprehensive safety planning. So just to review as well, again, probably you're familiar with the MARAM practice concepts. So these were brought in for working with victim survivors, and they are being used for when we're working with adults using violence as well. So we've still got the structured professional judgment as a key practice concept. So I'll speak a little bit more to that on the next slide. In the victim survivor guides, we had a person-centered approach. There's been a little bit of a shift in language of that when we're talking about adults using violence. The language that's used more so in the guides is around a person in their context. So we recognise that every person using violence has their own identity, circumstances that are going to affect their choice to use violence, the risk that they're presenting. So we want to understand that concept, that context. But in saying that, the person that we want to centre in understanding that is the victim survivor's experience. So the language has shifted a little to account for the fact that we're understanding the person, the perpetrator's context, while holding the victim survivor central to that. We're also, there's still a strong focus on having an intersectional approach. So understanding how people can be affected in engaging in service systems based on barriers to discrimination, prior inadequate service responses, as well as how they might disclose and talk about their use of violence, and how they might as well be targeting a victim survivor's identity, how that might impact their use pattern of behaviour. Having a trauma and violence informed approach as well. So we know that a lot of people, or a considerable number of people who use violence might also present as having experiences of trauma, whether that's migration, childhood trauma, racism. So in that space where we're working with them on their use of family violence, the guides talk about that, it's not about validating or excusing that behaviour through the trauma, but it's about being sensitive to the impacts and how that trauma might be impacting their use of violence, how we can prevent an escalation in risk, and create an environment where that person is most sort of open and regulated and open to change. And reflective practice and unconscious bias is a really important part of these guides as well. So, we all have biases as professionals through our own experiences and attitudes. So making sure that we are being self-aware and reflecting on how our own characteristics are kind of informing the way that we interact and respond to clients. Sorry, I missed one. And safe and non-collusive practice, particularly, so this is a really key practice concept for adults using violence. So we know that people using violence will often invite collusion from agencies and professionals that will kind of reinforce or minimise their use of violence or the impact of that violence. So it's really important that we know how to recognise what those invitations are and respond in a way that balances, where we don't want to agree with that violence supporting narrative, but also not being overly confrontational either. So kind of finding that middle road that opens up the conversation. And lastly, risk management approaches. So just making sure that people understand their responsibilities under that, and that we're focusing on the safety of victims, survivors in our risk management approaches. And particularly, when we're talking about working with people using violence, it doesn't mean necessarily direct work with that person. There's lots of indirect ways that we can still manage risk and hold them accountable. So things around information sharing, collaboration with other services, ongoing monitoring, secondary consultations that build our capacity to respond. All of that is really important, thinking about risk management as well. So in terms of structured professional judgment, just to jump back to that one, I'm sure you're probably all aware of this diagram from the victim survivor guides. While this has been used to assess risk with victim survivors, it's also reflected across in thinking about how we assess risk when we've got someone using violence in front of us as well. So the victim survivor self-assessment is still core to that. Sometimes we might have access to the victim survivor self-assessment, whether they're in our service or whether we've done information sharing. Even if we don't have contact with them at all, there's still ways that we can centre their experience. So making sure that, we've got at the forefront of our minds, how their identity is being targeted. So analysing those narratives and risk relevant information that we're receiving through the lens of how this is impacting the victim survivor. The second layer around evidence-based risk factors. So when we're working with people using violence, this might be direct disclosures perhaps, but a lot of this will also come from observations of what we're seeing, as well as those contributing and protective factors that might be happening in their lives as well. and information sharing. So with that third level, but information sharing will also inform evidence-based risk factors if we're receiving information from other services. Again, you'll be familiar with the FIS, how to use that. So using the FIS for people using violence as well is really important to be cross-checking information. And lastly, I touched on intersectional analysis already, so how their identity might shape the way their violence is expressed, how they're interacting with services, so making sure that we've got that lens when we're using our professional judgment to draw all these together into our assessment of risk. I'm just going to touch briefly on some of the key points in the risk assessment and management, and just to say that this is mostly drawn from the intermediate level. I've just pulled from that because I'm assuming that majority of people this will be most relevant. And I guess in saying this too, I sort of in talking about it, I also want to acknowledge that this is within existing roles. So, you know, I might be talking about, I guess just to flag that it's sort of relevant to your role. So some of this you might be able to do, you know, it will depend on the length and depth of rapport that you have with a person. So just to sort of say that, you know, I guess it can read as a bit of a tick box, but it's also sort of flexible in how we adapt these to different people's roles. So in terms of risk assessments, a key practice skill is going to be around the ability to observe narratives and behaviours. So particularly when we're talking about narratives, that's around picking up someone's attitudes and beliefs about their family members, their position of power. So we might be listening for those ideas around rigid gender roles, around a sense of entitlement, around how they might be using derogatory language or targeting someone's identity. Also narratives around, I guess, things that would be a barrier to their self-insight, reducing that personal responsibility for their violence. So if they're minimising the violence that they're undertaking, if they're sort of justifying it, if they're finding other reasons to blame for their use of violence, then we need to be attuned to that. And also watching for behaviours as well. So if you are in a space, you know, where two people are coming in and you're seeing that someone's talking over the top of someone, that they're trying to speak for them, that they're not wanting a victim survivor to be involved in their treatment plan, things like that. We need to be attuned to those behaviours as well. And then, as I mentioned, so in the intermediate level, there's that conversational tool, which is to support professionals that when they're hearing those narratives, how do you then open up that conversation? So it's a tool that provides support for those open-ended kind of curious questions about family dynamics at home, how they see their role as a partner or a parent or a family member. And what we're trying to do is elicit that further information to understand the person's context and their use of violence. Part of the risk assessment is also around the person's presenting needs. So the reason why they might be at your service, if they are engaging in substance use, if they are homeless. So those circumstances, of course, can affect a person's use of violence around that frequency and the severity. So we need to take that into consideration in our risk assessments. And also their motivations for seeking help. So whether they're sort of mandated or forced to be there, whether they've got a sense of self-motivation to engage with a number of services to make changes, also can impact. And lastly, part of the risk assessment, of course, as well, is around disclosures or information shared by other services about risk factors. So that's, it's important when we know that people using violence are likely to minimise their behaviour, important to get that information from other sources that will support in identifying the type and severity of their use of violence. And in saying that, just a reminder, this is, I guess, a snapshot of the risk factors that MARAM updated the risk factors in their foundational knowledge guide. So those with a green hash next to them, they're the new ones that they included as part of the victim survivor guides as well. So sorry when I'm saying they're new, as in MARAM, when the victim survivor guides came out, these were new. And those in red indicate an increased risk of being killed or almost killed. I think I saw in the VADA newsletter, it's got a similar slide to this as well. So it's always a good opportunity wherever you can to kind of post these, remind yourself of them. I guess the quicker that you get familiar with these risk factors, the easier and the more natural it is that you start identifying and remembering them. So where you get the chance, they're a good one to have up in front of you. And then lastly, in terms of risk management, so the guys really recognise that everyone can contribute to those to risk management, not necessarily just those directly working with a person on their use of violence. But it also means that people won't be asked to do things well beyond the scope of their role. So like I was mentioning, it sort of depends on the length of engagement you have with a person, whether they're aware that you know that they're using violence, their level of rapport with you, etc. But what we do want is we certainly want everyone at all of the tiers to know how to respond to immediate risk and what to do in that situation. Other responses with information sharing, of course, as relevant. So whether that's with victim survivor services in order to increase their safety, whether it's with other agencies who might be involved with the person using violence to help coordinate responses. And I guess as part of that as well, thinking about secondary consults, so building your own capacity to respond to. A big part of risk management too is around supporting that ongoing relationship, if possible, if you do have an ongoing relationship with the person, to continue building that rapport so that those kind of presenting, contributing needs can be addressed. It's an opportunity to enhance their motivation for change and as well to to stay visible within the service system so that we can continue monitoring their behaviours. At the intermediate level, there is a risk management plan. So that's something just for professionals, and that's around providing a structure for documenting actions around areas that need risk management. So kind of those, emergency and crisis supports, how do we contact with the victim survivor if needed, how we interrupt those patterns of behaviour. And then there's also a safety plan template too, which is to use with the person using violence for them to take away and be able to refer to. And so that's making sure that they have the appropriate numbers that they've identified, what protective factors that they can draw on, what steps that they need to take if they do, need to manage their own behaviour. So that's kind of a very brief snapshot. I guess just as sort of a main takeaway, just to reiterate, now's just the time to familiarise yourself. If anything, read the foundational knowledge guide, and to say that a lot of what's required really in risk assessment and management are things that you're probably already doing in your regular practice. Not everything there is new to you, I'm sure. So it's not, it's not about stepping well out of the role that you have. These guides are really about enhancing and streamlining that practice that you've already begun and that's already happening in a lot of sectors. So the tools really are just there to sort of support and document that work. I've got my email up there though, so if there are any questions or any things that you want to touch base with after, please do contact.
Thank you so much, Erin. I think the thing that stands out to me too in these practice guides is around like the things like you said that within this sector, the things that are already happening. So things like being able to hold traumas and intersectionality beside non-inclusive practice. I hear so many stories about the relationship with an AOD clinician and the ways that somebody can use information sharing and also have overview and identify and use non-inclusive practice with somebody who's using family violence while also supporting that person with a therapeutic approach. So those things are not mutually exclusive. And I really feel that AOD practitioners actually have really incredible skills at that. And I've just heard some incredible stories of how people have worked with their clients, and especially during COVID, during lockdown, where people have been kind of in the home, which we know increases risk when family violence is present, and the ways that they've maintained their relationships with their clients and been able to keep the victim in view within that and listen out for any risk factors that are present there, and use the relationship and also a therapeutic approach to make sure that everybody is safe in that home. So I've heard some incredible stories and some beautiful work. So in my mind, it all lines up. So thank you so much for like going through all of that as well, because I think people have been waiting and wondering, what is it going to contain? What are these MARAM tools going to contain for around people who use violence? So thank you. So we're just going to open up now to see if anybody would like to ask any questions of Erin at this stage. We will have more question time at the end. And I don't think I said as well, we'll have a breakout room section towards the end also, so that people can kind of come into breakout rooms without anybody, like without us in there, and have a talk about if there's anything that you think is a bit of a rub against practice. So anything you've heard today that really sits within these MARAM guidelines, is there any sort of rub? Is there any conflict within that? And we'll have a talk about that at the end. But right now we'll just open it up. Would anybody like to ask Erin a question?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there, Sheridan and Erin. Yeah, firstly, just one thought. I really like that person in context sort of language around working with people who use violence, just understanding what's in and around them. It is slightly different to that person-centered, where we're really validating or holding true to the victim survivor's experience and needs. But my question, I guess, is more around a secondary consult. When it comes to identifying risk, I guess, and that feeling that clinicians can have around what am I actually understanding, what am I seeing here? Who are some good sources, I guess, that a clinician can go to get a secondary consult?
Yeah, great question. So you can come to us. So, well, yeah, NTV support and run the men's referral service. So we have a procedure for doing secondary consultations, certainly. Welcome to call our number. We have a team leader who will give you a call back and then be able to provide that secondary consultation. So certainly us. I guess the other thing to think about as well is, local specialist services in your area. It's always a good idea to build those connections, support that collaboration at a local level as well. So if there are services running MBC programs, Orange Doors as well, who will have teams focused on perpetrator work, to reach out to them and have some conversations about the opportunities for perhaps setting up a bit of a streamlined approach for secondary consultations would perhaps be my other suggestion as well. Oh yeah, thanks Sheridan, sorry. Getting into
That's okay, I'm always aware of the amount of acronyms that we use. I think different culturally specific services as well, different, cultural groups that hold expertise and lived experience would also be good referrals as well in terms of getting understanding of secondary consultant understanding of lived experience. Could probably be a good point as well. All right, I think if nobody has, I'm just checking the chat. If nobody has any other questions, yep, we might move on. Thank you so much, Erin. And you're okay to stick around, aren't you, for questions later? Thank you. All righty. So we wanted to now introduce Mark Richards. And Mark is going to now put more of a focus on the practical and responding to disclosures and some of those kind of skills we might use when we're actually sitting with our clients who might be disclosing or where we might be identifying indicators of their use of family violence. So we're going to throw over to you now, Mark.
Thanks, Sheridan. And yeah, thank you to everyone sort of attending too. It's sort of great to see so many faces and so many people attending and obviously passionate about the topic matter as well. Before I do kick off, I'd just like to really acknowledge country and pay respects to the lands that we do all meet on today, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging as well. And that really deep-seated connection that's existed for well over 60,000 years and very much continues to exist today. Personally, I'm dialing in today from Barkindji country, so I'm in Wentworth, New South Wales, along the Darling River, traditionally known as the Barker River, just over the bridge from Victoria. So yeah, that's where I am today, and working from home. A little bit about me before I sort of do get into the content. Obviously, my name's Mark Richards. I'm a Wiradjuri man, so most of my family originate from up near the Blue Mountains near Sydney, and kind of spread out to places such as Dubbo, Lithgow, Bathurst, Orange, and places such as that. My background mostly is in recovery-based mental health. I've sort of been a part of the community sector now for roughly 11 years. Started off in community-based mental health when I was about 18, 19 years old. But the last 6 or 7 years really had a primary focus on domestic family violence, both working with victim survivors, but also working in the men's behaviour change space, working with men around how can they use their collective strengths as men in community to actually create a better environment for the women and children within their community, particularly within Aboriginal communities, and also working with men both one-on-one and in a group setting around behaviour change and actually addressing certain behaviours that they may have. Obviously mentioned before, I sort of do a little bit of work obviously in that space, but also really fortunate to work with organisations such as NTV, such as Lifeline Australia, Black Dog Institute, around many other projects. So if you have any questions at all that's sort of regarding really anything that I might be able to assist with, please just let me know. I'll try my best to answer. If I don't have a good answer, I'll make up something that sounds good anyway. So no, I won't really do that, I promise. But definitely feel free during this presentation, if you do have a question, please jump in. You can use the raise hand feature, all them sort of features that we obviously have access to. But if you just have a question and you don't want to leave it to the end and you really want to jump in and ask, and your memory is like mine and a goldfish, definitely just jump in and ask. Hey, don't feel like you got to hold on to that until the end. More than happy for people to jump in there. So to start off with, you will realize during this presentation, I'll bounce around a little bit. So I'm going to try to cover as many different sort of sections and topics as possible within 20 or so minutes. So you may think, Mark, you just spoke about 5 different things in 20 minutes. I've done that quite deliberately, just in terms of if anyone has any questions, we can sort of talk about a variety of different things and hopefully create some conversation throughout that as well. Obviously, some of the main drivers and things we've heard of, I'm sure, before at some point, main drivers around domestic family violence. Obviously, entitlement, the need to attain power within the relationship, acting like the master of a castle, and really treating their partner as less than, and having an expectation that certain needs will be met within that relationship. A lack of personal accountability. And a lot of people say, and I do believe definitely it's sort of the worker's responsibility to hold people accountable or, have accountability in the picture all the time. But I think a better way to sort of view it is to give the person we're working with the techniques, the tools, the self-insight, so they can actually start to hold themselves accountable for the violence that they're using and actually start to see the violence that they're using as a behavior and a behavior that can be changed over time, obviously, with many steps and a lot of hard work put in place. Really 3 words, I think, that sum up domestic family violence, really in any of the 9 categories, are power, control, and privilege. Really taking that power and control away from another person and utilizing that for yourself. And a lot of that goes back to the privilege that they feel that they actually have within that relationship. And again, seeing their partner often as less than. Also an unwillingness, I guess, to see the victim survivor or the person experiencing violence as their individual self. And we'll often hear terminology around, I guess, that person believing his partner is maybe like a possession or a certain item, rather than an individual, a person that actually does have strengths, does have people that love her, do, and also have, I guess, autonomy to make her own decisions as well. But quite often throughout that relationship, and because of the power and control, we do see a lot of that decision making actually taken away from her, and a real lack of choice that's actually provided within that family dynamic. The main driver, as we know, behind domestic family violence is gender inequality, realistically, and essentially the unfair difference in treatment between men and women based on gender alone. And statistically, if we were to look at the number one risk factor behind domestic family violence, statistically speaking, it is being a woman. Obviously, there's many other factors, many other sort of things that do contribute, but that one factor alone is our number one risk factor. Often when we talk with men around the violence that's actually happening, there'll be an internal narrative. So people have a violence narrative, an internal narrative that they actually tell themselves. And quite often people really firmly believe this internal narrative. And a few of the ways in which it can look, so obviously it looks uniquely different for everyone. I think whenever we're talking about humans in general, we're so unique, we're so different. So it can look very different for different individuals, but these are some of the common themes that we do definitely come across. Often his internal narrative will position him as helpless and views himself as a victim. Often during this as well, he'll actually try to get people around him, whether it be family members, friends, community members he comes into contact with, to also take this viewpoint and seeing him as a victim within that environment. Excuses patterns of behavior and patterns of violence. Generally, it's just outbursts, one-offs, or retaliation. So you sort of hear a lot of that type of language throughout that as well. Also shifts responsibilities to others within the environment, to the system as a whole. This is happening to me because of external factors, rather than the internal behaviors and the internal choices actually being made throughout that man's journey. Also justifies the use of violence as being acceptable or excused due to many factors. So obviously, we hear a lot of smoke screens such as, I guess, drugs and alcohol. We'll also hear things like mental health, many other smoke screens that kind of come into play. And although it's very important to acknowledge that man's past trauma, what that guy's actually going through at that current time, it's also important to acknowledge that although these things may have happened or still be happening to him, it doesn't actually excuse the violence. And it's really interesting when we start to have discussions with men around this as well. One guy comes to mind particularly that I worked with, and his scenario, he got really angry at his partner at the pub. And then I asked him what happened next. I was doing some work over a period of time with this man, and his exact language, which we'll often hear also, is, when I got home, I just snapped. And we'll often hear that, just snapped. So I asked what that actually looked like and kind of dug a little bit deeper into it. And it turned out that between him getting really angry at his partner at the pub and them getting home and him snapping, there was about 2.5, 3 hours difference where they were still at the pub in that time. So I was luckily, had a bit of a relationship with this guy. I was able to be quite honest. And I said, to me, if you were to snap, it sounds like it would have happened there at the pub when you got really angry at your partner. So the fact that you were able to actually wait until you got home sounds to me that you were able to put strategies in place during that 2 to 3 hours to control your temper, to control your behavior. And we sort of dug into that a little bit. And when we look at the stats around violence that happens behind closed doors, that statistic alone starts to tell us that violence is a controlled behavior. It is something that can actually be changed. And with how prevalent it is and the way the statistics are, if it didn't have an essence of control to it, we'd see it every day. We'd actually see it every day at the shops, at the service station. We'd see it down the street. So the fact that the stats are so high in regard to violence behind closed doors tells us that, you know, it can be changed, and there is definitely some control there. It's really important to, I guess, listen to the impact. I listen to the man's story. Sorry. It often provides a great deal of information about his underlying beliefs and attitudes. And also, if we really listen and we sort of start to understand what those beliefs and underlying attitudes are, it puts us in a position where we can actually start to provide some potential strategies that that man could utilize and that may work really well. With the internal narrative also, it often sort of minimizes, I guess, the impact that the violence is actually having on the people around him. So not only his partner, who's obviously quite often directly impacted, but also for other people within that environment, particularly children. You know, the most vulnerable citizens in any society in the world are obviously our children, and they're quite often heavily impacted by the violence. But also when we talk about that man and him potentially having children, they could also be a real motivating factor for him to access our service and actually start to talk about potential behavior change. I guess from us, as from a worker perspective, it's really important to have some self-reflection and really be aware of the impact that a man's story or a man's particular internal narrative actually has on us as a worker, or even more importantly, as a person, because ultimately we are going to be impacted by people's stories. And it's because we care. You know, we obviously come into particular fields of work for a reason, and we do care. So it's natural to take on some of that, but being really aware about that man's internal narrative, that man's story, and how it actually may impact us as well. Because I guess with things such as unconscious bias, and maybe sometimes allowing our unconscious biases to impact the work that we actually do with someone, they can work a couple of different ways. So our bias might actually be a negative in terms of we don't agree at all with what that person's done. We're struggling to connect. We don't really want to give that person our full attention. And these unconscious biases can certainly obviously impact in a negative way. But the other way that they can work is also us connecting with that person's internal narrative. And us actually, I guess, to a degree, starting to be groomed by that guy, because we, for lack of a better term, kind of feel sorry for what he had to experience maybe growing up or what he's experiencing currently. I know particularly early on in the field for me, when I started, whenever a guy would talk about the violence that he grew up with as a child, I'd connect with that. You know, it's something that I grew up with as a child, and a big reason that I sort of moved into the field of work I do now. But whenever I'd hear that internal narrative, I'd start to connect with that. And it really took a lot of self-reflection, because at the start, I didn't realize what was actually happening. I just thought I was being empathetic as a young person, as a worker. But after some really, critical self-reflection and some supervision, I actually started to notice patterns within the work I was doing and patterns within my own behavior, where whenever that particular internal narrative would present itself, I found myself actually connecting with that internal narrative and to a degree being groomed, and to a degree probably colluding with that particular individual. So it really took a good year in the practice for me to realize that. But I guess the beauty with self-reflection and things such as unconscious bias, once we make an unconscious bias a conscious thought, then we can actually take action on it. And we can only really do that when we start to actually ask ourselves questions and start to really have some critical self-reflection about what that could potentially look like. Erin mentioned intersectionality before as well, and I did tell you that I was going to bounce around. I think this is my fourth topic in about 8 minutes, so I did warn you. Erin did mention intersectionality before, and that's going to play a really big part in the work that we do, particularly going forward. And it's really looking at all the different intersections, all the different factors that make up someone's being, essentially. So if we were to look at intersectionality from a service provision perspective, and from maybe a perspective of a man accessing our service, we'll have a bit of a play around with that. So for people that maybe want to come off mute and contribute here, more than happy for people to put it in the chat also. But if we were to have and this is just, I guess, intersectionality in a nutshell, really. If we were to have a man, I won't give you much information on him. He's 22 years old. He's got 2 children, and he does use domestic family violence within his family unit, but also wants to seek service provision. What would be some of the barriers for this man in terms of accessing support services? Not everyone at once, please.
Hey there, Mark. Mike Carroll from MC Counselling. Great presentation, both of you, Erin, as well. Thank you very much. I think just trying to actually access the service and then making that contact, that initial contact with the service would be something that would be very concerning to him, and just something completely out of his depth in terms of emotional connectivity as well.
Yeah, definitely. 100%. Could not agree more there. It's a big step, isn't it? And it's quite confronting for people, particularly when they start to actually maybe look at what their behaviors they do have, and then all of a sudden actually trying to seek some support around that. It's a pretty massive step. Also seen the chat about potentially DHHS getting involved as well, which is a massive concern, particularly for families. It obviously becomes a big barrier and a big concern, particularly when we start to look at certain communities where there maybe is a higher rate of child removal and things such as that, most definitely. I won't sort of add too much more to that, because this next person, he's a 22-year-old man still, 2 children. He does use domestic family violence, but now he also is from a diverse community where English is his second or third language, and his English is quite limited. Those things we just mentioned then, we definitely carry across to him. But now, what are some of those extra, I guess, risk factors, or not risk factors, but barriers to access support for this guy?
Hi, Mark. My name's Daniel from Mary Health. I'm a LGBTI AOD counsellor, and a lot of my clients are people who use violence, and also some victim survivors. Coming from that perspective, where English is my second language, I use an intersectional framework, and where unconscious bias is a lot. So I actually think that the people you're talking to, specifically the one that you just mentioned, he won't be able to access any services because of his language, because of the if he's in the country, there's a lot of confidentiality issues. There's a lot of unconscious bias. Being a male, we don't even know who the partner is, or what the partner situation is, or their relationships, or anything like that. So coming from a white Anglo colonist society, this person will probably stay in the background as much as possible. That's my experiences of a lot of these people. So there's going to be a lot of barriers that young person will be facing, and they're a youth as well. So, thanks.
Yeah, no, and could not agree more with everything that you've just identified there, Daniel, 100%. So we start to see, again, extra layers of complexity for this particular guy. And as Daniel said, you don't know who his partner is. So all of a sudden now, and we won't really go into this, but I think it sort of creates a bit of a picture. All of a sudden now, this 22-year-old guy who is from a diverse community and English isn't his first language, he's also in a same-sex relationship. So all of a sudden, everything again that we spoke about for them first 2 guys, that gets carried across to him as well. But we start to add extra barriers. And we really only spent obviously 3 or so minutes on that. But you could actually start to understand when we really look at complexities or barriers to access support, there's many different sort of levels to that. And we can really add as many intersections to that particular man as we like as well. There's many other factors that could potentially be at play. But intersectionality definitely is something just to always, I guess, keep at the forefront of our mind when we are having conversations with men. And even when we're working with anyone in any capacity, really, within our sector, it's really important to sort of keep that at the forefront of our mind. I mentioned before motivations for change, and what is the guy actually coming to our service for? What is the reason for him to want to access our service, to want to start having these conversations? So there's often going to be many different factors at play, many different motivations. Some of those motivations may be external, and what I mean by that is he may have been told or enforced by the police to attend a service. So he may have been, for lack of a better word, forced to go there, which often we see, mandated through the courts to attend a particular service, especially if it's due to the violence that he may be using within the home and the reported violence. It's also people telling him, maybe, people around him, a friend saying, you need to go get this sort of stuff checked out. And although that may interlink with his internal, it's really still an external factor, an external motivator, someone else telling him he has to go and do something about this. So it is good to have a look at those external factors and those external motivators, but I think realistically, where a lot of the power lies is within the internal motivators. Improve relationship with his partner and family as a whole. You know, an internal motivator could be well-being and safety of the children, you know, wanting to be a more appropriate role model, wanting to be a better father is a really big one as well, especially if a part of that internal narrative that he has, that he's shared with us, is that he grew up with violence as a child and he hated the violence that he witnessed towards his mother. We can ask questions like, you know, you've identified to me that you did grow up with violence and it's something that you've seen your father use. I'm just wondering, and if you feel safe to answer, when you did witness that as a young person, do you remember how it made you feel? And you may hear words like scared, frightened, confused, all this sort of stuff. Then all of a sudden, when he starts to actually talk about the violence that he uses and the fact that the children have bared witness to that, we can start to ask questions like, when your children do witness you use violence, how do you think maybe it makes them feel? And often we start to hear very similar words like scared, frightened, they don't know what to do. So all of a sudden, throughout conversation, and this would not necessarily happen in the same one conversation. This may be over days or weeks or months, but we can start to connect the dots for him a little bit between how he used to feel as a child and now how his children actually feel witnessing him use violence. It could also be a sense of self, a desire to actually be a better person. You know, I think we're all got a little bit of a focus on self-improvement, but that can be a huge motivator for someone. Just wanting to actually be better than they are now. Also happiness and feeling safe with family, having a loving relationship, a long-lasting relationship, you know, actually wanting their children to grow up in a really good environment where they do feel safe, secure, believed, loved, and all of the above. A few of the questions, I guess, that we could use potentially to facilitate a process like that would be, what kind of relationships do you want to be having? You know, what does that actually look like? What sort of a relationship do you want with your partner? What kind of relationship do you want with your children? And we can actually expand on that quite a bit. What would you want to be doing differently to become a more nurturing or a better father? So again, what would that actually look like? You know, are there any steps, any things that you can put in place to move closer towards that goal of being a better father? What does being a good father look like to you? And sort of get him to unpack that a little bit. What's some of the stuff that you see you currently do that maybe doesn't make you a good father? And again, starting to really expand on that a little bit. Who do you want to be? You know, it's a big question for anyone in the room, realistically, isn't it? I know I think of that question. I'm still a little bit stumped by it, but who do you actually want to be? It's a little bit of a powerful question in a lot of ways as well, because it really fosters curiosity and really fosters quite a bit of motivation as well about really thinking about that particular question. What kind of a dad do you want to be remembered as? I think it's another big one. What kind of a partner do you want to be remembered as? What kind of a family member, a son, do you want to be remembered as? So often we're asking, I guess, more open-ended questions, particularly around rapport building and storytelling. Where we may have to start using a few more, I guess, directive questions is obviously when safety is an issue. So if we do feel like safety is an issue, we sort of naturally find ourselves asking a lot more direct and close questions in that particular stage. One thing that's really helped me, I guess, to, for the lack of a better term, to hear better, to understand better, to listen better, especially for these internal and external narratives, motivations, is listening out for feelings, content, and meaning. So 3 sort of factors that I find really, really important. I try to practice this as much as I can, because in my experience, since I've been using these 3 words and having a bit of a focus on that, I've become a better listener. I've become a little bit better at picking out certain pockets of information. So again, I'm going to play a little bit of a game and hopefully, you know, again, like last time, some contribution, but I'll share something that may be somewhat similar to what a client shares with us, particularly once they have acknowledged the violence that they are actually using. But I'll share sort of, I guess, a little bit of a snippet of information, and we'll start to pick feelings, content, and meaning out of that, and we'll have a bit of a play around with it. So if I was a client and I was to share something with you, such as, we spoke a little bit before about my behavior, and I understand it's not that good. It could be better, but I'm bloody confused. Like I don't know what to do. I never had a good role model, and I'm confused. I get angry, don't know what to do, and yeah. But one thing I do really know is I don't want my kids growing up with it. I grew up with it as a kid, and I don't want my children actually seeing this sort of stuff. It's not appropriate, and I could do a better job, basically. But I do notice sometimes, when I use the violence, I get a bit scared as well, because I don't know what I can do when I get angry and I feel like I'm going to snap. Sometimes it can get pretty dangerous and pretty scary. So it may not be exactly what someone shares with us, but once we build a bit of rapport with someone, I have heard similar type stories presented to me. But if we were able to break down feelings, content, and meaning, all of a sudden there's quite a bit of information throughout that. What would be the feelings? I told you a couple of times what I was actually feeling, and there was a few different words used there. Anything come to mind?
I guess you're talking about the feelings of the fear, like the thing that sort of, in terms of motivation for change, I suppose what I'm sort of hearing is that fear that this could get really out of control, this could get worse. I'm really saddened or frightened, I guess, for the kind of role model I leave my children. Those sort of things, like, to me, that was kind of the rich change talk I was sort of hearing in what you were presenting there. I don't know whether that's what the sort of feelings you were referring to, or what the feelings when they were in rage. I don't.
Yeah, that's a really good pick up there, Mark, because what you've identified in that snippet that you just shared was really a lot of the factors at play around feelings, content, and also meaning. The feelings were the feeling of fear, confusion, scared, and we can dig a little bit deeper into that. What does scared actually look like for you? What happens when you get scared? What happens when you get really angry? What happens within your body when you start to feel like you're getting really angry with your partner? Are there any little things that you're able to pick up on internally within yourself? The content is, there's been a bit of an acknowledgement of behavior there. He started to actually acknowledge that he could make better decisions. There is violence at play, and he can do something that's a lot better than that choice-wise. But the meaning, you're dead right. The meaning was around them internal motivators. I don't want my children to grow up with this sort of stuff. I want a better environment for my kids. So that's that real internal. And often the meaning will kind of give us a little bit of direction to go into, which I find really, really useful when working with people, because it kind of steers us in a certain direction to actually go on with that, man. I guess sort of towards the end and just sort of wrapping up, just to talk a little bit about self-care. And it's something that I always try to talk about whenever I give a presentation or program, just because I think the importance of it. So I guess if I was to ask, and I'm just making an assumption here, but if I was to ask everyone who's heard of self-care, believes that it's important, I'd say pretty much everyone would raise their hand, or pretty much everyone would nod their head. It's something that we obviously are very accustomed to hearing. But I think if I was to pose a similar question, and that question would be, who's heard of self-care? Who feels they practice enough self-care? Who actually feels like they put enough self-care and time in place for themselves? I'd make the assumption that maybe 20% roughly, if that, of the room would actually put their hand up. So it's really interesting when we start to look at that, around, we know about it, but we don't actually put that time in place for ourselves. So I think it's a really big thing to explore. And I guess the work that we do is going to have an impact on us. It doesn't matter who we are, but it is going to actually have an impact on us. There's no doubt about it. And we can't necessarily absolutely eliminate things such as burnout, things like that harsh sort of toll that sometimes these stories are going to have on us. But if we do have some self-care routines in place, it's obviously going to go a long way to mitigating that. And I think self-care in the past has been viewed as a little bit of a reactive model. We wait for something really negative to happen, then we put some goodness in place for ourselves, rather than actually viewing it as a proactive model. what can I do now? What can I put in place in my routine, day to day or weekly, to actually help myself, basically take better care of myself? I think viewing ourselves sometimes as important, and that really good advice that we give to a friend or a family member or a client when they're experiencing a lot of stress, sometimes giving ourselves permission to take that advice on for ourselves as well, I think is really, really important. And the last thing really is, obviously violence very, very prevalent, domestic family violence, it's extremely prevalent within society, within our country, around the world essentially. But a good thing to keep in mind, although it's prevalent, it's also preventable. And I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind, and maybe even a little bit of a sign that people should have in their office is prevalent but preventable. Pretty much that brings that little presentation to an end. I did promise that I'd bounce around and go here and there. I didn't even look at the time. I don't know if that was 10 minutes or 40 minutes.
You did well.
Apologies.
You did well,
There
Mark.
you go. I wasn't too sure. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And again, more than happy for anyone to ask any questions at all around that.
Thanks, Mark. I want to just come to the chat. And Natalie says, when you were saying what were some of the feelings present, Natalie responded, unpacking the cognitive dissonance through these discussions with the client. So yeah, I could hear that too, that you used the word confusion when you were speaking from that client's perspective before. And I think the cognitive dissonance is there a lot, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really,
totally.
that was a good point too.
Totally agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Was there others that were no more responses to that? Oh yeah, Mark is saying, I like the 3 words, feelings, content and meaning, as a simple thing to carry in our mind for further exploration in conversation with the person who uses violence. It's a great word too, the exploration, yeah, and remaining curious. I think were things that you've brought up there. Thanks so much, Mark. That was, like you did say you were going in different places, but it was, yeah, beautifully aligned. I suppose I wanted to just put it out there just in case, because I know sometimes people will say, like violence isn't always physical, which of course is true. And that and definitely when we're talking about children as well, I mean, we have a lot of data now around this too, that children are impacted, like they experience the violence even when it's not physical or even when it's not present in front of them. So anything we all know the feeling, even as adults, we know the feeling of walking into a room where there's discord or there's somebody's walking on eggshells around another person. And so for children through their developmental stages, they experience that at a really acute level. And because they look to, of course, they hold no power as well. So they look to the people around them for their safety. So because of all of that, and we could have a whole session just on children and family violence, because of that, even if there is no physical violence ever present, that the presence of parent control for children impacts them developmentally and through to their adult years. So we know that they're always being impacted. And the other thing I want to reflect on too was something that people tell me a lot, which is when we're talking about, when clinicians are talking to me about working with people where they start to identify that family violence might be present, they might be using family violence, is Mark touched on this, the idea of self-care, and that doing this work, sometimes it's just that practitioners will say to me, they end up in almost like a collusive kind of way working with that person, not because they're not kind of aware of it, but because they're burnt out. And because sometimes if that person's narrative is so strong and their victim stance is so strong, that sometimes just by pure fatigue, that person, it's a difficult thing. And I want to just acknowledge that, because it's definitely the work of behavior change programs. And if you're not a specialist, which I'm going to make an assumption everybody who's here today just attending in this community practice is not a specialist, then it really does take something sometimes. So I think what Mark was saying about the self-care, also knowing that's a truth, that a lot of practitioners will say that working in the the alcohol and other drug space, working with people where they start to identify this client might be using family violence, it adds another layer of complexity, especially when that person has very strong narratives and very ingrained belief of themselves as being the victim. So preparing for that as much as possible, knowing that that can happen, and having some sort of plan, like talking to people, talking to your teams about what would it take for you to feel that you have that support, you have that backing as well. Sometimes it might be that you need to have more than one person working with that client. Sometimes you need to take a team approach. Sometimes you need to have case collaboration around working with certain clients. And I think there's got to be some more strategies around that as we continue to build practice, and also as we take on that extra, what people are telling me is like an extra layer of expectation with the department having policy. So I know that sometimes that people feel the weight of that as well. So, and that will ultimately impact your practice. So knowing that that's completely human, and also to know that, you know, you could start to look at ways that will work for you and your teams to try and overcome that as much as possible.